My name is James Fallows. I'm a writer for The Atlantic. My function right at this moment is to introduce you very briefly to Tim Brown, who's going to make a presentation about the subject we'll then be discussing, his philosophy of design. Tim Brown is the CEO of IDEO. How many people here know of the IDEO company? Your fame is widely spread. How many people have been there to see some of the demos that are underway? I think you know that in design of every aspect of modern life, from consumer products to the ways that buildings are laid out to some of the just general planning of cities and flow, IDEO has had a phenomenal influence and to the better on how we live. And there's still a ways to go in parts of the world. They're not finally designed to your specs. But Tim Brown is going to begin with a presentation which will be a few slides about his latest concept, about his From Newton to Darwin and Evolution Design. I've read some of the material that underlies this. I think you'll find it very interesting. After his presentation, showing you some of what it looks like, he and I are going to sit down for a conversation for some of the implications. Then we'll open it up to you on the floor. But please join me in welcoming Tim Brown, the CEO of IDEO.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to try and roll through this fairly quickly so we have as much time for a conversation as possible, but there are a few slides. Apologies if I speak fast. So, as Jim mentioned, designs everything is, every part of the man-made world is essentially designed. Not always as intentionally as we would like, but it's essentially designed. But what I perceive happening around us at the moment is a bit of a problem with the way that we think about design, or have historically thought about design, and the way that we train designers, and the way that we practice design. And so I'm beginning to think about whether we don't need to change a little bit the context for design. This is a very early piece of thinking, so don't expect a kind of a bulletproof thesis here, but just a few ideas. I was taught to design things like this, simple products. The great thing about designing products that are, let's say, relatively simple like this is, I can understand most things about them. I know how they're made, I know how they're sold, I know who the users are going to be, I know what happens to them afterwards, because, they're not very complicated. I apologize for the shadows on the bottom there, but don't worry, you won't miss much. But as products or as design gets more complicated, as products get more complicated, it gets harder and harder for me as an individual designer, or even a team of designers, to really understand what's going on and take all of that into account when we're designing. So if we think about digital products today, this is an ATM. There are lots and lots, they get so complicated that there are lots and lots of places where design can start to fail. And when we go out to the urban environment, that gets even more obvious. When we think of urban planning, for instance, in this way, the original design for Columbus Circle in New York, then we can think of it as a traditional piece of design. We can imagine all of it. But the trouble is, cities are like this, not like that. And there's no way we can anticipate how a city is going to develop. And there's no way we can design a city in the traditional sense. When it comes to services, we do our best to try and design services in as complete a way as we can. So an example here is for a hotel chain, Marriott. I think it's their Courtyard Marriott chain, where every aspect of the customer experience has been attempted to be designed. In fact, we go so far as to script that design out. Every element, every experience, every step in the experience, every touch point. Somebody has thought through what that's supposed to be in order to make it as delightful or as appropriate as possible. The only problem is, no matter how hard we try, we can't anticipate everything, as even some of the very best service organizations have found to their cost. JetBlue, I think, is one of the best design service experiences there is, but even they don't get it right all the time, as some of you may remember a couple of winters ago. So what's kind of going on here? Well, in my opinion, it's quite simple. It's all about things being complex. It's all about complexity. This guy is a French mathematician, the name of Henri Poincaré, who in the 19th century tried to solve a problem that had been set in a sort of open source competition by the French government. It was called the three-body problem. Now, the three-body problem, apologies because I'm not a mathematician, essentially tries to predict if you understand where three bodies, maybe in space, are at any given moment, tries to predict exactly what's going to happen in the future. Apparently, the French government were worried about planets falling out of their orbits and things like that. Poincaré worked really hard to solve that problem, and he never did. Although he did invent topography as a form of mathematics along the way. He never could figure out how to solve what sounds like a relatively simple problem, just three moving parts. Every one of those designs I've just talked to you about have thousands of moving parts. So as the number of decisions go up, so the complexity goes up. And the chances that we're going to get it wrong or not imagine something that's going to happen in the future goes up along with it. So here's really the shift that I think we're having to make about design. I think that our existing ideas about design are fundamentally based on this guy. I imagine everybody knows who he is, a guy called Isaac Newton, relatively well known. And the reason I think that is because design today sort of assumes an ability to predict the future based on our actions in the present. We're top down about the way we design. We try to be predictive. We imagine the future in terms of a complete system. And yet, so often that complete system fails to behave in the way that we anticipate. And so what I think we have to do in order to respond to the ever-growing complexity of the design challenges that face us today is to think more like this guy. I'm sorry, I like old Brits, so I keep using them in my slideshows. This one, of course, is Charles Darwin. And to start to think about design as more of a sort of constantly evolutionary process, rather than a one-time, upfront predictive process. So design becomes more about bottom-up change. It becomes more about emergence, about design never being finished, but constantly evolving. So I think that's quite a big shift for us to take. It's certainly quite a big shift for me to take kind of in my head in the way I think about design. And I think it's got a lot of implications. So there are a few sort of principles which I've been exploring. Again, in no way is this a fully complete thesis, but there's a few here that may help us start a conversation. What some of these principles might be towards a more Darwinian, if you like, approach to design. The first of these ideas is that we're fixated in our world of about designing objects. But actually, objects aren't so important. What's important is the behaviors around those objects, the behaviors that we as human beings, both either as kind of social systems or individuals, the behaviors that come from our interactions with those objects. It's a more difficult idea than thinking about designing a chair or a cup, but how do we think about the design of the behavior that goes around that chair or the behavior that goes around that cup? So a nice example of where that works, or has worked historically, is this one. Any of you that have traveled in Europe on the high-speed trains may have seen this sign inside the lavatories. It's a vain attempt to get the male of the species to be less inaccurate than they naturally are. And again, any of you who've traveled on those trains will know how ineffective these signs are. But the guy who ran Schiphol Airport about 25 years ago, he had an idea, a different idea about how you might go about this. And it was all about designing a behavior. And he came up with this. Now, many of the guys in the room will recognize what this is. I assume most of the women won't. So I'll explain it to you. So this is a fly, as you can tell. And what he realized was if he printed a fly in just the right place on the urinal, he gave the guys something to aim at. And it turns out when you give us something to aim at, we're far more accurate. In fact, it turns out we're 80% more accurate. So it's cut down the mess in the world's lavatories by 80%. I think quite a contribution to the well-being of mankind. And it was absolutely about designing a behavior. The fly, it didn't matter. In fact, there are all kinds of different versions. There's even a version, a friend of mine sent a picture of, there's now a version in Germany with a little goal and a little kind of football on this mat. For the World Cup or European Championship obsessed amongst us. It doesn't really matter. The object didn't matter, but the behavior did. Another thing that turns out to be true about complexity is that the more complex a system is, the more information flows through it. And so if we're going to be designing more complex systems or for more complex situations, we have to be thinking about designing with and for information flow. Dr. Nick Christakis, who I think is actually here this week. I think I saw his name on the speaker list. Has done wonderful work with James Fowler, looking at how information in social networks causes different behaviors, and has done some great work. If you may have read his book, Connected, from a couple of years ago, where he talked about how people in networks of obese people are 3 times more likely to be obese themselves. That's a really interesting piece of data that we can design for, and we should design for. And some companies have done a really good job of designing with data. Anybody who was in the room for the previous session was hearing lots about that from the CEO of Palantir. But Tesco's, for instance, in England, used their club card. It was a very expensive investment for them to launch their club card, because you may not know, but supermarkets make about 5% margin on their sales. And they were giving away 1% of that margin on their club card. So that's 20% of their profits they were handing over back to customers in order to gather the data that the club card gathers. But they have made enormous use of that information in the way that they design customer experiences, the way they design their product mixes in their stores. And they launched this in about 1995. They have since become the largest supermarket chain in the UK by designing with information and for information. Another thing to learn from evolution, another thing to learn from biology, is that faster iteration equals faster evolution. These things, bugs, viruses, the reason that they evolve much faster than we do is because they iterate much faster than we do. Their cycle of iteration is hours, whereas ours obviously is years and decades. And so how can we take this idea of fast iteration in order to evolve? Some companies are doing this by taking early ideas that they might have for new offerings or new propositions. In this case, this is a State Farm, the insurance company, that was interested in whether it could build a different kind of relationship with young customers who they did not understand. They're an insurance company. They don't understand Generation Y at all, and so, or millennials. And so they thought, well, maybe if we built somewhere for them to come and learn more about financial services, that might be useful. Now, what most companies would do lots of research, figure out whether this was a scalable idea so that they knew whether to build 100 of them or not. State Farm didn't do that. They just built one and started to learn from it. Built that one, and then with no idea whether they're going to build more of them. So this notion of launching to learn about a market, for instance, is a way of iterating faster and evolving either your understanding of the market or the products and services you want to put out into the world. Another idea that I'm intrigued by, I don't know how much use of it we're going to make in design yet, but is this idea that one advantage we have over natural evolution is that we have conscious thought. And so we don't have to rely on random mutations to get somewhere interesting. We can actually do something that you might call selective emergence, selective evolution. We can kind of choose what might be interesting and design things that help get us there through many, many iterations. There's a technology called genetic algorithms that do that. And genetic algorithms are being used a lot in the software industry, but they're being used in some other interesting places too. This is one of my favorite places where I've seen it being used recently. These, as you'll see when they come up on the screen, this is something called a strand beast. And it's a roving sculpture by Theo Janssens, who's a sculptor that lives in Holland. And these things walk along the beaches of Holland where he makes them. And you can see the mechanical joints, the sort of hip joint that is very non-intuitive. It's like nothing we've ever seen before. The reason it's like nothing we've ever seen before is because he used a genetic algorithm to design it. An engineer would have maybe designed something that looked like something we'd seen elsewhere, but this algorithm kept iterating and iterating until it got this sort of perfect joint that's made out of this PVC plumbing pipe for his machines. I think another important idea when it comes to working with this idea of an evolutionary approach to design is about how we think about using experimentation. Experimentation in the traditional sense, where we have a hypothesis and we design an experiment to test that out, and we learn from that experiment in order to evolve our hypothesis. I think somebody who's been speaking about this very effectively recently is Eric Ries in his book, The Lean Startup, where he talks about the need to build, measure, learn, and repeat. And we've had some interesting experiences of trying to do the same thing in a sort of more of a design environment. And we've been working recently, we do quite a lot of work in Africa around helping serve the poor. We have a non-profit arm of IDEO called IDEO.org, and we've been working on sanitation in Ghana. And we had this fairly obvious idea that there are places where you can't dig septic pits or provide plumbing, and so low-cost sort of toilets where you take the waste away every 2 or 3 days, seems like a good choice. And so we were out doing the normal research that you do when you're doing these sorts of projects and asking the potential customers of these in cities in Ghana, well, what our idea is that we'll give you these toilets, and when they need filling, somebody will come and take the waste away, and you'll pay for that. And many of the customers said, no, that's too expensive. We don't want to pay for it. So we were skeptical of this idea. So we decided to run a design experiment. We gave 10 or so families one of these toilets, and we went away for 3 days. And then we came back. Then we asked the question again. Would you be willing to pay to have the waste taken away? Every single one of those families said yes. So now, we have a nice little system of toilets and these little businesses which come and collect the waste and take it away. So we've got this kind of nice virtuous circle of a sort of a business model for these toilets. And we wouldn't have learned about that unless we'd run that experiment. Indeed, another NGO which was proposing a similar idea did the same research, didn't do the experiment, tried to roll out at scale with the concept where customers would take the waste away themselves, and it failed miserably. So where are the places we can use quick experiments to learn in order to evolve our designs? And another idea that I find very interesting that comes out of evolution, particularly comes out of emergence, is this notion of focusing on simple rules. Simple rules create the most fascinating outcomes. I mean, the flocks of birds you see in the autumn as they migrate, these amazing patterns are based on very, very simple rules. A bird might choose to be no more than 18 inches away from the bird around it, and that alone creates these amazing flocking patterns. And we're seeing these ideas turn up, in some cases quite literal ways, although fascinating, in terms of, for instance, the way these self-aligning robots that are developed at the University of Pennsylvania, the way that they behave is based on very, very similar kind of flocking, simple flocking rules. But we're also seeing this idea of simple rules applying in all sort of human situations. Anybody that lives in San Francisco might have come across Buy Right stores. It's a remarkable grocery store, very small, run by an amazing man called Sam Moganam. And he has some very simple rules about the way the way the employees work within the store and interact with consumers. If an employee in the store is within 10 feet of a customer, the idea is that you look the customer in the eye. If you're within 4 feet, you have a conversation with them. Well, these simple rules, amongst others, has made Buy Right this service phenomena, to the point that some of the world's biggest retailers now fly to San Francisco to go and interview Sam and go and visit the store to see how they create such a wonderful service experience for their customers, all based on very simple rules. And then there's this notion, as I mentioned at the beginning, that design in an evolutionary world is never done. It's never finished. That's a very hard idea for kind of conventionally trained designers to come to terms with. And I'm going to talk about that right at the end. But there are places where we're used to the idea of design being never done. World of Warcraft is this wonderful environment which is constantly being designed by its players. New elements are appearing in it all the time. And it gets richer for that. So we're seeing in many, many places where this idea that design doesn't get done and then used, design gets constantly iterated and evolved. Then I think the final idea that is extremely important if we're going to have this more evolutionary, perhaps less centrally controlled idea of design, is how important the power of purpose is in that sense, in creating the sort of self-governance that these more complex systems need. We've seen it in the political environment already. We've seen the power of a strong sense of purpose to create political movements, whether it be Arab Spring or Occupy Wall Street, using, in many cases, social media technology. But there are companies also that are using purpose to allow them to experiment with new ways of thinking about either being of business or their products that they may not otherwise have been able to do. I think the example of Patagonia is an interesting one. I mean, a company that actually tells you not to buy its products is a kind of a weird idea. But when you look at their sense of purpose, which is all about combining the outdoors with preserving the environment, it's not so crazy. And it's allowed them to build a very different relationship with us as consumers because of that. So to finish off, I'd like to talk about just, this is a slightly sort of designy thing to talk about, but designers have built we've built what we do based around certain artifacts that we create. And in a way, the most kind of iconic artifact of the design process is this one. It's a very old piece of technology. Some of you may not know what it is. It's called a blueprint. They used to really be blueprints once. They were pieces of paper that when you finished a plan for a building or for a product, the way you copied it was through this chemical process that produced these blueprints. But that's not what's important. What's important is the idea of the blueprint was once you created a blueprint, the design was done. And that blueprint was the instruction set for somebody to go away and make it. Maybe it was a factory or a construction company, but that you got to do no more design once the blueprint was finished. And that's really an inherent part of the way we traditionally think about design. The design gets done, the designer walks away, the thing gets built, and people use it. But that doesn't work in the world that I've just been talking about, this world of design that's constantly changing. So what's the replacement artifact that we need to use in design that replaces the idea of a blueprint? I think it's this one. I think it's code. Now, this happens to be genetic code. And one of the reasons I put it up on the screen is because as designers, we're already beginning to use genetic code as one of the ways in which we express things in the world. I have teams of designers working at UCSF, for instance, in San Francisco, with synthetic biologists exploring what it's going to mean to design living organisms, because we will be doing it at some point. But there's another form of code which we're working with every day, all the time, and that's this kind of code. And so this idea that the artifact of design is more like an instruction set, and that instruction set can continue to evolve, is maybe more appropriate as we think about the future, because it allows us to be open-ended, emergent, constantly evolving, and never really finished. Okay, that's all I had to talk about. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Tim, for that wonderful introduction. I was struck by two things as I was hearing your presentation. One is you embody your own principles, and the number of rules you are listing at the end are different from and augmented from the ones that were in a published article version of this.
It's always changing.
Yes, but I know that because I've been reading the previous version, so I admire that quick iteration. The other fact, I think how many people in the room are designers or somehow in the design business, and how many people are not? So the majority of people are not designers. I think people who are not in the design business have to be struck when hearing your presentation at the gap between what you are laying out and what we encounter in our daily life, much as if you hear a political philosopher talk about the ideal arrangement of society, then you pick up the newspaper and see what is actually happening. And I wonder if I could ask you about some of the connection between the way you are saying things could be and the actual world of design in which we work, and how your influence can spread. Just one sort of baseline question I wanted to ask. With your perspective as a man of IDEO and a man who knows how design could be, as you go through your life, what things do you see that drive you most crazy in terms of, I'll give you an illustration that is on my mind coming here. I will have to go through Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C.
That would have been my instantaneous response. As somebody who spends far too long on an airplane, pretty much everything to do with the experience of flying, but also pretty much everything to do with the experience of healthcare, a lot to do with the experience of education. I mean, and really that's what got me to thinking about some of this stuff. It's because the things I'm interested in trying to figure out how to contribute to as a designer are not the next version of this so much as how can we make a difference in healthcare or education or travel or other things that are complex systems, where the very idea that you could stop it, redesign the whole thing in some complete crystal clear way, launch it and then walk away is ridiculous. And so if that is ridiculous, then what way can we contribute as designers? And so that really is what led me down this path of
Yes.
wondering whether we need to change the way we think ourselves.
And so the times where I've seen myself IDEO designs have the most sort of thoroughgoing reform is where you actually have control, like in factories in China. I've seen many of our mutual friends there, they're working. What can you do? I mean, if you have the view that a lot of the public systems we deal with are sort of fundamentally ill-designed, there's a different way it could be, what do you do next to try to deal with these hospitals or to deal with transport systems?
Well, I mean, I think the way that we've found most often we get the opportunity to do is to find some piece of it that seems relatively instrumental in everything else. So, for instance, several years ago, we started to look at how could we improve some of the key parts of the hospital experience. So, emergency rooms, for instance. The emergency room massively affects. If you go through the healthcare system with a healthcare emergency, the experience in the emergency room itself massively affects your overall experience. Right. If you go in there and they don't know who you are and they don't know how to deal with you and they leave you left in a hallway on a gurney for a couple of hours, I mean, all that completely affects the rest. So that was a place where you can go, it's still complicated, but you can go in and do something better. Or a project that we've just finished doing that is also in healthcare, but is more connected to some of the conversations that have been going on the last couple of days around the new Healthcare Act, is that we've just finished developing the prototype user experience for the new healthcare exchanges. So here's something that is going to affect a lot of people's experience of healthcare. It's how they're going to make the choice of which healthcare program that they're going to pay for. That's a very difficult and complicated process. Today, where it's done with paper, and there are hundreds of choices, massively inefficient. Under the new healthcare laws, kind of a lot of people are going to be having to make these choices, and every state is going to have to manage.
Or they're going to get to make these choices, as the Supreme Court has now told us.
Right. Now they're going to get to make them. Yeah. And so we worked with the California Healthcare Foundation and a number of states to create the sort of prototype user experience. What are the key pieces and parts of that? How are we going to give people reasonably simple choices so that they can make intelligent selections? Put that together as a prototype, and then each state will then get to kind of develop its own individual version on top of that. So it's like giving them a platform to use. So that, again, it was an example of, it's not the whole healthcare system, right, but it's something that's going to be relatively instrumental in people's experience. And
the governmental officials had the wit to come to you to design this, as opposed to just doing it in-house?
The California Healthcare Foundation had decided to ask us to be involved, which was great. Yeah.
In the other aspects of public life, whether it's emergency care, emergency rooms before you have changed them, or airports or whatever the rest, what is the main barrier, do you think, to their adopting better design principles? Is it cost? Does it cost any more to do it your way?
I mean, as we found out in manufacturing, often redesign processes are much more efficient. They're actually less costly. To be honest, I think what prevents most organizations thinking about this stuff is it never occurs to them to ask the question. They often don't have a very high degree of understanding of what their customers and consumers actually go through. One of the things that I've learned over the years is that very often when a healthcare organization comes to us and asks us to help, and you start to talk to them, you find out relatively recently before that, one of the senior executives had to go through a healthcare experience themselves. And suddenly they had empathy for what it's like.
Yeah.
Or maybe one of their family members had to go through it. Suddenly they realized how frustrating it was. And, well, maybe we should do something about this. So it doesn't, and it's true of all organizations, it doesn't occur to us to ask those kinds of questions. We don't have a deep enough understanding of what our consumers go through. And so the urgency to change is not there. And the resistance to change, of course, is always huge in any organization.
In the same model of people who've had an experience that gives them more empathy, has the TSA come to you?
Yes, but I wouldn't say it was we learned a lot.
Tell us more.
Well, we in the previous administration of the TSA, we did do some work with them to try and look at where the opportunities for change might be. And although there's a lot of fixation on the sort of technology that we go through, and it is frustrating to go through these scanners and line up and disrobe and all this kind of stuff, and that does have to improve. An awful lot of what affects our experience is actually the behavior of the TSA folks themselves. And so there was a proposal, and they started to roll it out, and I don't know how well, I'll leave you to judge whether it's gone very far. But they looked at a training program which was intended to take away some of the extreme rule-based systems that they used. I mean, one of the things that I think many industries have learned is that the more rules you apply, the less sensitive a system is. And so, if you want a system that's sensitive to, a little old lady that is struggling to get through security, or a foreign visitor that doesn't speak the language, but you apply lots of rules to that system's highly unlikely to be able to adapt and deal with those things. So you actually need to give the people in that system much more independence to make judgments. You've got to train people to do that because they've still got to be very conscious of where a security risk might be. There was a great article, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, a month or so back by Chip Hawley, who was the head of the TSA when we actually went and did that work, talking about a lot of these issues and his view of how the TSA needs to evolve in order to be more adaptive and agile, which is what I think a lot of organizations need to become.
There's some more questions I'm going to ask you about the projects that IDEO is doing. I want to ask you a few questions about IDEO itself as a culture. What do you look for in the kind of people you want to have on your team who will view the world in the distinctive IDEO way and adopt some of the principles you've been talking about?
I mean, we've obviously always looked for very creative people, people with great imaginations and great skills in whatever field they come from. And we have many different fields. We have people from the technical side, engineering skills, or design side, or many human scientists, psychology, anthropologists, things like that. We have lots of unusual people, like we have practicing physicians who work at IDEO who run off and they'll go and do surgeries at Stanford for a couple of days a week and come and work on our healthcare projects. So we have lots of variety of people. So we look for deep skills, but we do look for this kind of empathy gene. And we look for it for two reasons, because for one reason is it's very hard for us to solve problems that meet the needs of others unless you're willing to go out in the world and try and understand them. And then the second reason is most of what we do is too complicated for individuals to work on their own. So we need people to work in teams. And so that empathy gene helps people not only understand how somebody else might be approaching a problem, but we're really interested in people who have high degrees of enthusiasm for how somebody else might approach a problem, to the point they may actually want to go practice that approach themselves. We have a lot of people who become, who might have started off, I started off as a trained to be an industrial designer to do products. I very rapidly learned how to design user interfaces because I was fascinated by it. And we have a lot of people like that at IDEO, kind of crossover folks, and we look for that kind of energy.
And there are certain corporations that are famous for their distinctive entry exams or interview techniques. Is there what is unusual about how you assess somebody coming to you?
Well, more and more. I mean, we've always essentially tried to put people in the situation where they're practicing design to figure out whether they're the right fit for us. We have done a lot of that through a big internship program, but nowadays we also set design challenges for a lot of people. We have this open innovation platform that we call Open IDEO, which is a big kind of community of about 40,000 people in the world that help us work on social sector design problems. We use that quite often now. We often ask people, we want to see what you're doing on Open IDEO to see how you're contributing to those projects before you come and talk to us about whether you want to join the company.
Right. On some of the work that IDEO does, again, you had the illustration there of the toilets in Africa, and I know that one big part of the company's and the foundation's emphasis now is design for poverty, design for inequality in the world. Can you tell more about, beyond the toilet, other things you're doing in that regard?
Yeah, I went through sort of a kind of a bit of a transformation a few years ago when I was on a trip to India with Jacqueline Novogratz, who runs the Acumen Fund, for those who may know her. And we visited all of her investees, and at everywhere I looked, I could just see incredible design opportunities. I mean, design should be changed. Design this, redesign that. Why aren't you thinking about that? And I was astounded by how much opportunity there was. And of course, there are very few designers working in the social sector. And so that was what got me excited and us as a firm excited about trying to find ways to do it. So now, largely through IDEO.org, which is our not-for-profit piece of IDEO, we're working on clean water projects, healthcare projects, financial services projects in South America, early years education programs here in the United States. So it's across a fairly broad range of subject matter, but again, we find because there aren't a lot of designers working in these fields, there are so many places where we can either make small differences or big differences if we get the chance.
And are these things that you support yourself, or we say not-for-profit is a...
So
yeah.
we raise, we've set IDEO.org up really just the same way we set IDEO up. So it works like a little consultancy. Mm-hmm. And so foundations might help pay for some of the projects. We raise some philanthropic funding to help, so we can bring the cost down as low as we possibly can. But we want this to be sustainable and scalable, and we're not big enough to be able to do just lots and lots of pro bono work to make this. I think there's an opportunity for at least as many designers to be working in the social sector as there are working in the private sector today. And right now the imbalance is obviously huge. So I want this to scale. I want I want this to be a model that other design companies or other organizations might try out.
I have just one or two more questions before I open it to the audience. You've mentioned sustainability in various forms. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a conference in Shanghai about sustainability in terms of urban design, the ways in which, in terms of transport layout, of building insulation, and all the rest, you could have make huge differences in environmental impact by design. How does IDEO approach this environmental sustainability question? What sorts of your projects are involved there?
Well, I mean, one of the things we try and do is build that into as many of our projects as we can, because, I mean, sustainability isn't something you just go do sustainability, right? I mean, if you think about it, every project we do affects our environment in some way or another. If we're making a product, then we're using resources, we're using energy, if we're creating an environment. So we try and where we can, bring sustainable thinking around materials, around systems, around energy flows, all that sort of thing, into as many projects as we possibly can. We do find ourselves working on sort of ones that are more specifically about about sustainability, particularly around product systems and how we either simplify them so that they can be repaired more easily, or source different materials in order to make things. But we're also really interested in kind of urban design. We're really interested in we've been working a little bit in things like how local food systems and and cities might start to come together. I mean, we have to think differently about where we grow and how we transport our food. Certainly in developed cities where we can afford to do that, and there's some really exciting possibilities. I mean, I'm excited to see even places like Detroit where urban farming is beginning to kind of happen because there's space there now. And so let's put farms there instead of leaving it as kind of wasted space.
This is an unfair question on the line of which of your children do you like best, et cetera. But of the IDEO innovations that have had broad impact that people here would recognize, which are you proudest of?
It's an impossible question to answer.
Or how about a couple?
I mean, I continue to be proud of the work that we do in healthcare, working with, Kaiser Permanente over many years, the Mayo Clinic over many years, but also many other healthcare institutions, both here and abroad. And funnily enough, I mean, we've also had the opportunity to work on quite a lot of kind of consumer-facing financial services in the last few years. I think sort of post-crash, a lot of the banks realized that perhaps they weren't serving their customers at the retail side as well as they might have been. They've been largely ignoring us because they'd been focusing on other activities. And so, many of these tools you can see out in the world now that help people manage their money better are things that we've been involved in. There was the Bank of America Keep the Change project several years ago, PNC Bank and all of what they call their digital wallet program we were involved in. A number of others, Citibank has got a new spin-up that we were involved in. So that's fascinating because it's not a place that design's traditionally had much influence. And it's interesting to learn about financial services, and interesting, and they touch all of our lives. We're often not very engaged with it, and so it's an interesting place for design to play a role.
So this is my last big picture question, and I'm turned it over to all of you. In various disciplines around the world, people can describe an arc of either progress or of regression. For example, if you think of political science in the United States, many political scientists feel that over the last half century there's been increasing dysfunction in modern life. In medical care, of course, you can see progress in various ways. As you survey the design you have seen around you during your working lifetime, are we in a period of ascent, or is this a period of gathering darkness and bad forces are overtaking good innovations like yours?
I think it depends on how you choose to look at design. I think if you look at design from the traditional sense, from the sort of beautiful objects we choose to surround ourselves with, I might argue that the sort of height of great design was 20 or 30 years ago. Although there are a few companies, obviously, that buck that trend. Yeah. Our friends in Cupertino being one of the obvious ones. But I think if you take the topic of how design is being applied to sort of everything we do, and particularly how it's being applied to help businesses think differently about what they do, then absolutely in an ascendance. And even more so if you measure the number of particularly young kids that want to have a kind of creative piece to their careers, then I've never seen in the ascendance in the way that it is now. I mean, we get 25,000 applications a year to work at IDEO. Wow. And we're a 600-person company. We hire 100 people. Yeah. And that, for me, is just an indication that a lot of people want to do something creative, and we happen to be a brand that people have heard of. And that, I think, is a great sign, because those people will go off and figure something else to do that's creative. Either they'll, I'm tremendously excited by what's going on out in the world of sort of design and social media. Whether it's things through Kickstarter and all these wonderful little products and things that are getting funded, or whether it's Etsy and this craft movement that's emerging. 3D printing is going to offer us ways of making things in the way that we haven't been able to before. And then you look at the kind of digital side, and there's just this plethora of better designed software than we've ever seen before. I mean, some of it built on well-designed platforms like the iOS platform or maybe the Android platform, but the opportunity to improve our world through what we do through digital design is enormous. And if it hasn't happened already, I'm pretty sure fairly soon the number of broadly described digital designers in the world will outnumber all the other design categories added together. That's certainly true in the Silicon Valley already, but I think it will be true worldwide eventually, because there's so many opportunities to either deal with complexity or make people's lives better and allow them to do new things by designing great software.
It's good to have a note of cheer. So yes, questions starting here. And are there microphones? So yes, gentleman here in the glasses, the microphone's coming to you. Please identify yourself. Yes. Go for it.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. My name is David McConville. I'm with the Buckminster Fuller Institute. And I was struck by a human-centered designer using these evolutionary principles and how similar those are to a lot of the principles within Fuller's design science, biomimicry, even permaculture. And within resilience science and looking at how systems bounce back, there is no distinction made between social and ecological systems. They talk about social ecological systems. And it seems that for a while when we talk about design, you just sort of tipped your hat to it, that there's this idea of sustainability, and there's a dawning awareness that we are actually part of these evolutionary systems, and that managing complexity requires that we dissolve this boundary. And I'm curious if you could talk about that a bit, because I know that's been a real critique of design from people like John Thackara, who are sort of disturbed at the lack of responsibility that designers take on in designing within a cradle-to-cradle kind of perspective.
Yeah, I mean, Buckminster Fuller figured this all out when most of us weren't even around yet. So in many ways, we're resurrecting ideas perhaps that have been around for a long time, or we're rediscovering them in our own way, like every generation does. My concern has been, and I spoke about this a little bit in my last book, has been that design has been operating as a priesthood for too long. And that the tendency for design when it does that is to ignore these bigger systems because they make life more complicated, they make life harder. It's so much easier. When I first trained as a designer, I was only interested in how beautiful something was. And it was so much easier to do that. It really was. Slowly I realized that just wasn't enough. But I think the sort of releasing that's happening today of design beyond the priesthood of professionally trained designers to many, many more people will, ironically, I think, convince us all that we're all part of this big design ecosystem and that we're all making contributions to the design of the world around us, and we all have a responsibility to be thoughtful about the contribution we're making to that world around us. And I hope what happens with professional designers is that we learn to help enable that rather than control it. I think of design as much as a hosting and enabling activity, as a forming or form-giving activity. But in order for that to happen, there's a lot of rethinking and retraining that's going to have to go on. There's a lot of rethinking that's going to have to go on in academic institutions. There are some that are already leading the way. I mean, I'm very excited about what's happening at the D School at Stanford, because what that is doing is introducing people who are not professionally trained designers into the design experience while there's still time for them to take that into their careers. And so whether it's business school students or medical school students or school of education students and engineers and designers working together on figuring out what design might be. And I'm excited that other universities around the world are beginning to look to replicate that model.
Yes, over here. This, up in the okay, how about right there? Yes, the woman in the middle of the, yes. Did you have your hand up right there?
You need one of these kind of laser pointers.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your very inspiring presentation and talk. I'm very excited. And my question is...
And your name, please?
I'm Kei Koki. I'm working for this recovery of tsunami survivors.
Thank you.
And you suggested to start from something instrumental, but the reality is so complicated. And what do you suggest us to simplify? What do you suggest us to do to simplify the rules?
This is where I get stuck. The unstated piece of my not yet thesis that I've been talking about is that you still at some point got to design things, right? I mean, if design's going to have any value, we've still got to stop and say, we're going to go design that. And that actual process of trying to understand what the needs are, forming different alternatives of what a response might be, perhaps experimenting more in a more iterative way, but essentially going through the process of developing that idea, that doesn't change. I mean, those core fundamental design process doesn't change. It's the context around it that I think is changing. So when it comes to a very complex system, like perhaps it's rebuilding a whole societal system in a vast part of a country, then I don't see. I mean, maybe we're going to be clever enough through, very large data systems to begin to see form and pattern at that very high degree of complexity that allows us to understand what we're designing from a high degree of complexity. But we don't seem to be quite there yet, and so I don't see that we have much choice but trying to find the places where we think we can make the most difference, but maybe the new thing we also have to do on top of that is to think about the hooks that we're building into whatever we do that allow other pieces to bond, to connect onto that. I mean, I'm a big believer in APIs, another thing that comes out of the software industry, which are pieces of technology that allow the thing that you've designed to talk to something else that somebody else has designed, right? And that the software industry is being very clever at doing that, and that's why we have these wonderful systems and platforms to build on today. The reason we can build something on top of Facebook is that Facebook has a whole bunch of APIs that lets us do that. And I think that's a concept that we need to take to all of design. What are these hooks, these interfaces that we can build if we're designing a particular service or we're designing an object that allow those two things to come together as neatly and usefully as possible? And I don't think there's been a lot of thinking done around that, but that may be the additional piece beyond just trying to pick the places where we think we can make the most difference.
So I think if everybody who has a question would raise his or her hand, I get an idea of what the landscape of the room is. So how about up here in the front? And I will try to note everybody I've seen. Yes, in the front.
Thank you. I was interested in your comment that you choose 100
You
people.
identify yourself, please.
Oh, Buzz Zano from here in Aspen. Interested in your comment, you choose 100 people out of 25,000 applicants. When you associate with creative people, do you find that it's more a fact of biology or training and in the environment?
It's both, right? I mean, when we look for certain kinds of people, and then they come into our culture and they adapt to that culture, and if they don't adapt, they probably don't last a whole long time. And one of the reasons why we hire most of our folks fairly young, out of graduate school, or when they haven't been that long out of graduate school, is because they're moldable, you know, and they adapt to our culture. And it's always been quite. We have hired people who've got lots of experience and come into the firm, but it's always been very hard for them, and also quite hard for us, because they have to adapt to a place that's not necessarily like anywhere else they've been. But when you have a culture that is, I mean, we're a very self-governing culture. I mean, I don't have a whole lot of control theoretically as CEO. I don't have very much control, and that's how we want it to be, because we want people to feel absolutely they've got everything they need to be as creative as they can be for whatever company, whatever client that we happen to be working for. And you know, and so when you've got that, it's an incredibly resilient asset to have. I mean, you know, I'm a big believer that the future of all businesses is to have cultures that are as self-governing as possible. That doesn't mean anarchic, but where individuals have as much freedom to contribute as is reasonable for whatever that business does. Because I think that approach is far more resilient and agile than an organization that's built on very inflexible rule sets. And so it can take a while for people, particularly when they've come out of school, which to be often is just the opposite of being self-governing, even though we may claim or hope otherwise, for them to get used to a place where they kind of have to decide what to do. And so you know, and if somebody's come out of a career of being in a place where they get told what to do all the time, it's very hard.
So we had some back in this quadrant.
Hello, my name is Paige Knutson-Coles, and I chair the National Board of the Trust for Public Land, which is a land conservation organization that conserves land for people to use and enjoy. We do a lot of work in urban areas creating parks and open space. And I wondered if your firm has much experience in park design, especially in creating behaviors that encourage people to come use parks. One of the things we're emphasizing is that if we create an area within a 10-minute walk of everyone, that obesity will go down because people will actually be active. So the question is about your firm, but then do you know anything, or what's your view of the state of park design in the United States?
The answer is we don't have very much expertise about designing anything. I mean, because we love to design everything. I mean, that's not quite true. We've done a lot of some things over the years, but we don't have a lot of experience of designing parks. We've done a couple of projects which I think are kind of in that general space, working with cities to look at creating kind of revitalized districts, which are often where it's often the outdoor space that's more important than the internal space. I mean, my own experience is recently having spent a bit of time in New York, and that whole West Side park that goes all the way up the waterfront now, I think is a remarkable, and the High Line, of course. Between them are just two remarkable examples of urban park design that seems to have. I mean, they're packed. I mean, the last time I went to the High Line, which was a pleasant day, I think it was late October last fall. I mean, you could hardly walk along it. Yeah, it was actually hard to get any exercise because you couldn't walk more than about a mile an hour because it was so busy. But I think projects like that show that parks can be just remarkably vibrant pieces of the city. And so we're actually working right now with the High Line on the third phase of that program. No, I'm really excited about what the urban outdoor space can achieve in terms of, well, and of course New York has now got all these stats about, I think it's a 3-year additional life expectancy for residents of New York, and about the only hypothesis, there's 2 possible reasons for that. One is people are in generally closer to healthcare facilities. So, but the one that most people believe is that people walk more in New York, and so they are actually less obese.
The corresponding figure from China is that people in Beijing have a 5-year lower life expectancy than otherwise because of air pollution.
Yeah, I can believe that.
Yes, over on the side, yes. Actually, there's 2, so we'll do 1, then 2. So actually, the lady in the middle, then over. This will be our next 2. And then we'll.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Gwen Hopkins. I'm at the Aspen Institute's DC campus. And we're a big organization, as you can see, with a lot of moving pieces. So I'm interested to hear about ideas, sort of decentralized model that you're talking about. As CEO, just wanted to ask what the actual logistics are of running an organization to make sure that your staff, as you empower them, have the mentorship that they need to carry out that level of responsibility that you're talking about. And then also just the nuts and bolts of making sure information is traveling back and forth fast enough so that everyone at the organization feels they're part of the same ship moving in the same direction.
Yeah, good question. How best to be honest about this? No, I'm a big believer in purpose as a way of creating a sense of direction. So we do our best to talk about why the heck we're doing what we're doing, and we have a point of view that ultimately we should be measuring everything we do based on the impact that it has in the world, preferably positive impact. I mean, in terms of mentoring, I'd say we've done a occasionally decent job of it and occasionally less decent job of it. One of the problems with a decentralized culture is it's very easy to let smart people, leave them alone to get on with what they want to do, and then you realize, perhaps we're not giving them as much mentoring as they might. And I think if you went and spoke to, kind of the average IDEO person, they would say they'd like more mentoring. But it's a real tension, right? Because if you apply it in a traditional kind of big corporate sense, then I believe you remove self-governance. So, and so we're constantly struggling with that, and I would say that we have not yet solved it. In terms of knowledge sharing, we are not big believers in sort of conventional sort of warehousing knowledge kind of approaches to knowledge sharing, because one thing I find about designers is they hate reusing other people's ideas. And so even if you do warehouse all that knowledge, they don't use it. So it's much, much better to have knowledge-sharing systems that inspire designers to think about things they wouldn't otherwise have thought about. And so we're a big storytelling culture. That's the principal way in which I think we share knowledge is through stories, either written stories or filmed stories or in-person storytelling. And it's a bit of an obsession with ours. And kind of wherever you go, your job is to have some stories to tell. And if you do a piece of work, your job is to have some stories to tell about that work. And we find that's more effective for us than big reports that live on databases somewhere. Because as I say, it turns out designers aren't very good at using them. They don't read very well either. That's the other problem.
So we have just a couple minutes here. Let's get a few questions on the table. Just question, and then you can give an omnibus answer. So question over here.
Thanks for the discussion. This has been really interesting. Joe Muscat with Ernst & Young, but my question relates to my role as a board member for the Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship. It's a group that we work with at-risk youth to try to use entrepreneurship as a way to change their goals and help them hopefully maybe come work for you someday. But the question relates to education. And, a big part of what I've heard you talking about, whether it be relative to design or your own organization, relates to collaboration. And increasingly, education is very standards-based and very data-driven in a results orientation. So maybe if you could share some thoughts about how we could think about this evolutionary design principle in the context of education.
Sure. Great, thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Fred Kent. I work on public spaces around the world. What I want to ask you is, how do you look at chaos? Like when people come into a totally dynamic environment, like a great market, you could talk about the market at the ferry terminal. You come into that and you watch people, they just start to get comfortable. They start smiling. They start touching. There's affection. And you go into these kind of corporate spaces, and people are uptight. You don't see them kind of relaxing. Everything tells them what to do. They're being controlled. But when you go into these sort of wonderfully uncontrolled, dynamic places, people open up and they become themselves, and they show themselves off as to who they really are.
Okay, thanks. And was there a question up here? Yes. And wait just a second for them. Oh, actually, the microphone is coming to you. So we have education, collaboration, we have chaos, and we're going to have one more, and then you can give the omnibus wrap-up. Why don't you just... Oh, sorry, there's one other... Yes.
Yes, Jerry Weissman,
Yeah.
Palo Alto, California. The eternal question, does form drive function or function drive form?
And yes, sir, in the front, you can just speak.
Yeah, Mike Gildenhorn, Washington, D.C. Closed system, if you look at Apple, it's a closed system of design. You look at Microsoft, now they had an open system. Now they want to design their own pad, have that control. With Google, the phones, they now buy Motorola Mobility. They want to have more control. Can we conclude anything between open systems and closed systems?
So you have 3 minutes to tell us about education, chaos, form and function, and closed systems.
I'll try and take them in order. So education, I'm really interested, particularly when it comes to innovation and entrepreneurship. I actually think that maybe a kind of university-style education is not always the best way of teaching that. I'm kind of interested in the notion of bringing back apprenticeships, but focused around those kinds of... I'm also interested in the notion of apprenticeship around software design too, actually. I don't know that for all practitioners of this stuff so I think a mix of kind of, gaining new knowledge and practical training at the same time is actually an interesting way of picking up those skills. So I'm interested in the idea of apprenticeship. For me, a great market is not chaotic. It's vibrant, but it's not chaotic. In fact, I love nothing more than when I want to have kind of a meeting with clients and talk to them about what great design is, I actually take them to the Ferry Building, we walk around and have a meeting, and I point out all of the interrelated pieces that go to make that a wonderful experience. Now, they're not controlled from the top down, but you've got restaurants and vendors, and you've got kind of a whole bunch of cultural stuff going on. You've got the role that the water plays. I mean, these are all interrelated, but there are patterns there, and you can see the patterns, and you can take those patterns and use them as inspiration to do something somewhere else. And so there's a vibrancy and a level of activity that often doesn't exist in corporations, I'd agree. But I think you can take that as inspiration. Form following function, I have a hard time kicking that notion because I'm a great believer in kind of beautiful engineering. It drives the form of beautiful things. But I think the problem is that with most things we're designing today, there are hundreds of functions, and therefore there are hundreds of forms. And so it's too simplistic to get down to this point of there's a single function, therefore there's a single form. So I think we're struggling to deal with that kind of complexity of function leads to a complexity of form. And then, what was the last one?
Closed systems.
Oh, yeah, right. So I love closed systems, but I think closed systems are inevitably part of an open system. So even Apple, with its closed system in terms of an iPad or an iPhone, has created a semi-open system with the iOS app platform that's then part of a much bigger open system, which is what I as a user do with everything else that that iOS and Apple is part of. So I think if you look, it's a bit like if you look at a natural ecosystem, there are lots of closed. It's sort of from an analogical point of view, closed systems. They're the individual species operating in that ecosystem, but they're operating in an open environment. And so I like both, and I think we need both. And I think we need companies that have got the bravery to create closed systems that are really great for users and consumers. But those systems have to have. I'll go back to the kind of hooks in them to allow them to integrate with the other things that we're trying to do in our lives, rather than trying to compete with those things that we're trying to do in our lives. So, I like both.
So, with that tour de force ending, please join me in thanking Tim Brown.
Thank you. Really good. Thank you.